falling out with France. The Muslim world is in uproar after President Macron criticizes Islam and defends caricatures of Prophet Muhammad. But will protests aimed at hurting French pocketbooks have any effect? I'm Ali Hassan, and today's newsmaker is the movement to boycott French goods. President Emmanuel Macron's remarks earlier this month, calling Islam a religion in crisis, has strained France's already fragile relationship with its own Muslim minority. And now his defense of cartoons considered offensive is causing political rifts on the world stage. Across the Middle East and South Asia, the backlash is expressing itself not just in the streets, but in supermarkets and shopping malls. As the hashtag Boycott France trends on social media, everything from cheese to perfume is being pulled off store shelves. And as Adam Pletz reports, Macron's stand for freedom of speech could come at a cost.
Protesters across much of the Islamic world are calling for a boycott of French products. It's a reaction to President Macron's defense of cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, depictions of whom are considered blasphemous by Muslims. He was speaking at the funeral of French teacher Samuel Paty, who was beheaded by an 18-year-old man of Chechen descent in retaliation for showing drawings of the Prophet in a classroom.
Nous défendrons la liberté que vous enseignez si bien et nous porterons haut la laïcité. Nous ne renoncerons pas aux caricatures, aux dessins, même si d'autres reculent.
Muslim leaders have denounced Paty's brutal murder, but many are angered by what they consider Macron's attack on Islam. Some world leaders have criticized Macron. Pakistan's Imran Khan has accused him of deliberately provoking Muslims, and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has supported the boycott.
Ben de şimdi buradan milletime sesleniyorum. Sakın Fransız markalara asla iltifat etmeyin. Bunları satın almayın.
European leaders have expressed support for Macron, and the EU has questioned the legality of some of the boycotts.
Les accords de l'Union européenne avec la Turquie prévoient le libre-échange des marchandises. Donc les obligations bilatérales auxquelles la Turquie s'est engagée en vertu de ces accords devaient être pleinement respectées.
Rallies have been held in French towns in support of their president's stance, and some of the leaders of France's 6 million strong Muslim community have denounced the call for boycotts.
Nous appelons bien sûr à défendre les intérêts de notre pays et face aux appels au boycott contre les produits français, nous appelons les musulmans de France à être très vigilants et à dénoncer ce type d'appel qui tente de diviser notre société et de séparer les citoyens de confession musulmane de leurs concitoyens.
But supermarkets in Jordan, Kuwait and Qatar, as well as smaller outlets in many countries, have removed French goods. And popular sentiment in Muslim-majority countries appears to be with the boycott.
يعني وتزيد تدعمهم بمالك، يعني أنت تخرج من الصبح علشان تصير تشتري منتجات فرنسية ولا يهودية.
The French motto is liberty, equality, fraternity. But in fighting for freedom of expression, is Macron infringing on the equality and fraternity of Muslims? Adam Pletz, The Newsmakers.
To discuss this, let's go to our panel. Joining me now from the Pakistani city of Lahore is Sardar Masood Khan. He's the president of Pakistan-Administered Kashmir. Nabila Ramdani joins us from London. She's a French-Algerian journalist who specializes in French politics, Islamic affairs, and the Arab world. And also in London is Philippe Marliere. He's a professor of French and European politics at University College London. Welcome to you all. Quite a heated debate. Sardar, many Muslim countries are joining the boycotts of French products. The list is long: Iran, Jordan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Turkey, Indonesia, Kuwait, Qatar, Egypt, and so forth. What is the goal here? What are you hoping to achieve with this boycott?
This condemnation and denunciation is becoming universal, and this kind of denunciation is being expressed not only in the Muslim countries, but in non-Muslim countries. And the purpose is to convey a message to President Macron, but also to the Western leaders, that this practice of Islamophobia or incitement to hatred would not be acceptable anymore to the Muslim world. This is against the United Nations Charter, international law, and many treaties and conventions that are there to protect the rights of followers of all faiths, including Islam, and therefore this systematic practice cannot be allowed. This is the message, loud and clear message coming from the Muslim world. Let me also tell you that in France itself and many of the Western countries, there are laws against denying Holocaust or making statements in regard to anti-Semitism and so on, and you can't propagate Nazism or fascism. So similarly, in the same vein, you can't insult the Prophet of Islam. You can't insult the most precious and the most revered icon in the Muslim world.
Nabila, the boycott is here to send a message to Macron and the French government, says Sardar. Do you think this message is being heard in France and by the president in particular?
You know, I think he will come to a point where we'll have to hear him. Otherwise, otherwise he will lose an awful lot of friends in the region. The reason why Muslims are calling for a boycott of French products by Muslim majority countries is because the Macron administration has effectively incorporated cartoons mocking Islam into its domestic policies. And up until now, Charlie Hebdo images portraying the Prophet Muhammad as a thoroughly pathetic figure who is there to be mocked, along with all followers of Islam, have been considered marginal and anti-establishment. But Macron has changed all that. He promised that he would not renounce the caricature and defended them as part of French culture and indeed France's global image. And by doing so, Macron has effectively made them mainstream and indeed normalized them in his bid to put Muslims in their place. And if we can, look beyond terrorist attacks, and I appreciate that it's very hard in times like these, but this is the first ever French administration to place pernicious propaganda aimed at humiliating Muslims and indeed placing them outside civilized society in its policies. And dare I say, the current cartoon on the front page of Charlie Hebdo is not a playful satire of President Erdogan. It's a vile depiction of Muslim women as gormless sexual tools for pervert Muslim men.
Right.
And at the same time, it once again attacks the Prophet Muhammad in the most despicable language.
Philippe, let's go back to the boycotts because despite the boycotts, President Macron remains defiant. As a matter of fact, he said it loud and clear. He said, we won't give up our cartoons. This is a matter of freedom of expression, and we won't be cowed into silencing and compromising our values. Is he right?
I think what is very interesting to note is that there's a change in tone and content regarding Charlie Hebdo's cartoons and Macron, because when he was elected 3 years ago, the young president, out of the blue, I think he was far from being a hardliner on this issue. On the contrary, he was kind of embracing a kind of more multicultural outlook, for France. And I think his view on laïcité, which, by the way, if you look at the law and the jurisprudence, is not laïcité shouldn't be about banning religion, let alone humiliating worshippers. It's just the interpretation of some groups in French society who are pushing very hard to make sure that, bit by bit, Muslims notably get excluded from public spaces. So Macron initially was not one of them. On the contrary. But I think what happened, and I think that's why it's very, important to note that to the outside world, is that I think he's a bit of a follower on this issue, i.e., in his own camp, in his own government, you have people clearly who are pushing very hard this anti-Muslim, Islamophobic agenda. And instead of resisting, and I think it has to be for political reasons, Macron is now following the trend. And I think that's something very new and puzzling. And of course, a lot of people in France, and non-Muslims that is, are very surprised and also taken aback by this change of position regarding the cartoons and Islam in general.
Interestingly enough, Sardar, all of a sudden France finds itself in a war of words and symbols, if you will, with the Muslim world, which, as you know, is otherwise hardly ever unified. But in this particular case, they have come together to condemn the cartoons, but also the response on the part of the president and French officials to these cartoons. What is the way out here? Are you looking for an apology on the part of the French government and the president? Because clearly, looking at what he's saying, that's not forthcoming anytime soon.
Well, he has to give an unqualified apology, but I think that he cannot give such an apology because he has the stiff competition with his electoral opponent. And he has made this statement, I mean, analysts say, in order to outcompete the extremism of his adversary. So I don't know whether condemnation, an apology would be coming forth. But let me underline another point. You know, this reaction from the Muslim world and Muslims living all over the world also signals Muslims' resolve to resist this kind of Islamophobia, which is rampant. It is not just confined to France. It is rampant in the rest of the Western world. And Islamophobia is being used for political purposes. Now, Muslims are saying that they are not powerless, that they have economic clout. I mean, these consumers all over the world which consume Western goods, and in this case, French goods, can boycott them. And therefore, there can be not only boycott, this is the beginning of a process, there could be boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Islamophobes. So I think that Muslims are demonstrating their economic prowess and their power to punish if their icons and their revered figures are not respected.
Nabila, do you think any backtracking on the part, do you foresee any backtracking on the part of the French president here? On one hand, Sardar is saying, we are sending a loud and clear message, and it's going to hurt France economically, if not in the short term, certainly in the long run. But as Philippe was also pointing out, President Macron really can't afford to backtrack here for domestic political reasons, can he?
Well, I think if anything, Mr. Macron actually provoked the whole thing. He acted in a manner that was rash and unstatesmanlike following the vile murder of Samuel Paty, the teacher beheaded by a Russian-born terrorist. Mr. Macron bizarrely made out that images portraying the prophet as a nude cretin with his genitals hanging out were somehow state-approved and should indeed be displayed to school children as much as possible. And he has solely suggested this, that this is a good thing in regards to Islam, but not to other religions. And this is the definition of hateful cruelty. It is, in fact, astonishing that Mr. Macron is effectively starting a war with Islam over these cartoons instead of ending the antagonism immediately by saying that the cartoons evidently break all race and religious hate laws and that he's not prepared to see the conflict carrying on. But instead, he's giving the cartoons official approval, even though such blatantly racist and indeed hateful cartoons should be outlawed under French hate legislation, of which there is many. And let us be clear about the nature of these cartoons. They associate one of the most cherished and indeed sacred figures of Islam, and indeed all his followers, with bombs and terrorism in general, stupidity and indeed pornography. And such malicious caricatures have nothing to do with free speech whatsoever and would not be allowed in countries such as Britain or Germany, for example, just as portrayals of black people as slaves on a leash or black politicians as monkeys eating banana would not be allowed in these countries. Yet this is exactly the kind of obscene material that Charlie Hebdo publishes. And instead of condemning them, what the French government is now doing is they hold those vile caricatures as noble testaments to the secular state. And in fact, there are many laws in France that make these cartoons illegal.
You said these cartoons would not be projected and displayed and published in other European countries. But Philippe, it is a fact that many governments in Europe are coming out in display of solidarity, are coming out to defend Macron, saying, no, this is, at the end of the day, freedom of expression. This is a dangerous path, no? I mean, this is almost gearing up to be a clash of civilizations at a time when the world is already in the midst of a very grueling and excruciating pandemic.
Yes, absolutely. First, I think I'd like to say that the cartoons have been published in various European countries, even if, of course, one has concentrated on the case of France around the issue of Charlie Hebdo. I mean, the controversial drawings of the Prophet were initially published in Denmark, and in fact, Charlie Hebdo in 2015 republished them only. That's simply to say that, but it is true that, in fact, a lot of it concentrates on France. I think politically, yes, it's a disaster. Clearly, I think. The way, of course, various European governments have to come out now in support of Macron. We'll see to what extent they do it and how many of them do it. But I think, yes, because seen from France, I think the line goes as follows. And again, I'm trying to sum up just what the situation is in France, is that, of course, we do that because we are in a democratic country. So there is freedom of speech, although personally, I have all the reservation that Nabila just put forward a moment ago, but this is the way it is seen. So now it's a very frontal, it's a clash between those who think that freedom of speech doesn't mean that you've got a license, means license to publish anything, against those who think, yes, no, we are the country of Voltaire, so we are actually entitled to do that. And there are people, of course, who will argue that we do not simply attack Islam, we also attack Judaism and Christianity. There's an element of truth in that. The trouble with Charlie Hebdo is that progressively over the years, they have tended to concentrate more and more on Islam. And quite obsessively lately. And I agree, it is poor taste, it is distasteful, it is most of the time unfunny. And this is the problem. And there are lots of people in France who are making the point. It is, yes, to freedom of speech, yes, about mocking, criticizing religions, like any dogma, you should be free to do that, but no to doing this sort of a constant bashing of Muslims, because in the end, one talks a lot about the Prophet, but in the end, these are the worshippers, the Muslims themselves, French people overall, who get day in, day out criticized, mocked, ridiculed by those cartoons.
But Sardar, what about those people who say, yes, this is a needless provocation, yes, those cartoons are insulting and hurtful and displaced and uncalled for, but at the end of the day, we are living in the 21st century, and this is a matter of freedom of expression, as the argument goes widely and frequently here in this part of the world, in Europe. Is this a logic? Is this a reasoning you can follow to a certain degree?
This is skewed logic, I would say, because, this is the 21st century, no doubt about that. And freedom of expression is upheld by international fora and international law and domestic laws, no doubt about that. But there are double standards. I mean, in Europe, in most of the European countries, there are laws against anti-Semitism. Why is there no law against anti-Islamism or Islamophobia? These are double standards. And second, I would say that there are international and domestic laws against xenophobia and racial and religious discrimination. So I think that this freedom of expression is not without limits, and therefore this is a false logic, false rationalization of the political exploitation of religious differences in a society. Now, let me tell you that people looked up to France for liberty and equality and many other ideals. France is disappointing the rest of the world because there's rise of ethnic nationalism, fascism in many parts of the world, and that includes the Western world. And they think that bashing up the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is electorally profitable. So what we see is this kind of political dissimulation, which is being used to demonize Islam and their prophet and their followers.
Nabila, as a matter of fact, even before the gruesome and crucial killing of the French teacher Samuel Paty, as you said, who was beheaded for showing his class, the cartoons, very vile acts. Even before that, Macron described Islam as a religion in crisis and introduced a new law to fight Islamist separatism. What is the way out here? Obviously, at this particular point, he is in a corner. The Muslim world is ganging up against him. What would be your advice to him?
Well, I think, what the French establishment and indeed Mr. Macron is doing is using a very perverted version of the secular republic, of laïcité, if you like. French laïcité, in fact, rightly respects religion, and French law rightly protects religious and cultural minorities. The problem is that hateful cartoons that would normally be considered illegal are somehow being elevated to great symbols of modern France, a country which seems to be embarking on a war, not just against the kind of vile criminal who murdered Samuel Paty, but against all Muslims, and not just the millions, 6 million or so living in France, but close to 2 billion Muslims around the world. And this is shocking in the extreme. And I have to say that a crucial aspect of all this is the abject fantasy that is involved. There is a myth that has developed that Samuel Paty was actually teaching an accepted curriculum, that is to say that Charlie Hebdo cartoons are now regularly distributed in state schools. This is not the case.
But clearly that doesn't justify him being murdered.
Nobody has ever said that, and I cannot stress enough the abject horror of what happened to Samuel Paty. The point is that instead of the government taking its responsibility and ending what seems to be, an ongoing conflict between extremists, and instead of destroying this absurd myth that Charlie Hebdo cartoons are somehow part of the curriculum straight away. Right. That is to say, by having an official government spokesman saying we can state unequivocally that Charlie Hebdo is not taught in any schools. The myth has just been left to grow, right. And President is happy to propagate it. And so many people will think that it is being taught as part of the curriculum. And the other deceit is that anti-hate cartoons means you condone barbaric terrorism, and that is particularly disgusting.
Philippe, what is the way out of this conundrum that we are all in right now? Because this is going to dominate the headlines for some time to come.
I think that following the appalling murder of this teacher in France a couple of weeks ago, I think there should have been a national debate. And first of all, a debate about if there is isolated cases of terrorism, and there are some, killing innocent people. I think that there should be a debate about, for instance, civilians' protection. How does French intelligence do to monitor and then capture people who are a threat to the overall population? Let's remember that in previous terrorist attacks on French soil, many Muslim people were killed. So that's really, those attacks kill all kinds of people randomly. So there wasn't any debate about that. I think probably because there's been a bit of dysfunctioning regarding French intelligence. The second issue should have been Macron standing and having, sort of trying to unite the nation and to uphold the democratic values instead of endlessly repeating, the values of Republic, laïcité, and so forth and so on in a pretty abstract manner, which I don't think helps clarify the matter. So instead of that, what you had, the media, mainstream media, and the French political class in general looked for scapegoats and found some very convenient ones, notably university lecturers, which allegedly were accused of spreading, so-called anti-republican values, and being against laïcité,
Right.
simply because they were critical. Secondly, the anti-racist left, notably those fighting against Islamophobia in France, and thirdly, Muslims themselves. You made a reference to the law, which is now in the pipeline on separatism. It's supposed, again, to be yet another law to fight terrorism. And we know very well it's going to be yet another law which is going to single out the Muslims in general, and again require from them, then they show yet another pledge, another oath of loyalty to French Republican values. So I think it's a missed opportunity again, and of course Macron can be seen as responsible for having missed the chance of uniting the nation following the attack.
Right, a missed opportunity indeed. As it stands, the call for a boycott of French products on the part of many Muslim countries out there stands. Sardar, Masood Khan, Nabila Ramdani, and Philippe Marliere, thank you so much for your insights, your opinions, and the context that you have provided into this complex situation. Thank you out there for watching. Hope you enjoy this, and hope we'll see you back when we are coming back to you with a new edition of Newsmakers.